A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
You know, Herman, there is a strange kind of map in my head, where the borders of Europe do not actually end at the Mediterranean. If you look at where the money flows, where the scientists travel, and where the data cables are buried, you see a version of Europe that extends all the way to the Levant. It is a geographic paradox that has always fascinated me. On paper, Israel is a Middle Eastern nation, but in terms of institutional architecture, it is practically a member state of the European Union in all but name. It is this invisible infrastructure that keeps the relationship humming, even when the political winds are howling.
That is exactly right, Corn. Herman Poppleberry here, and I have to say, this is one of those topics that really highlights the divide between the loud, performative world of high-level politics and the quiet, ironclad world of institutional integration. Our housemate Daniel was asking us about this just this morning, specifically about the friction we are seeing from Dublin. It is a fascinating prompt because it forces us to look at the plumbing of international relations. People see the headlines about diplomatic spats, but they rarely see the thousands of research grants, the aviation protocols, and the trade standards that bind these two entities together. We are talking about a level of enmeshment that is almost impossible to untangle without causing massive systemic damage to both sides.
It is that plumbing that makes the current situation with Ireland so jarring. We are seeing a very deliberate, very persistent attempt by the Irish government to basically take a wrench to those pipes. They want to dismantle a relationship that has taken decades to build. Today we are going to dive deep into what we call the Israel-European Union Nexus. We will look at why this partnership exists, why it is so difficult to legally unwind, and why Ireland is currently acting as the primary antagonist in this geopolitical drama. We are standing here in March of 2026, and the tension has reached a boiling point that many analysts did not think was possible even 2 years ago.
It is a massive topic, and it really gets to the heart of how the European Union functions as a consensus-based organization. Before we get into the friction, though, we really have to establish the baseline. How did a country in the Middle East become a cornerstone of European scientific and economic infrastructure? It starts with the EU-Israel Association Agreement, which was signed way back in 1995 and came into force in the year 2000. This is the legal bedrock. It governs everything from trade in manufactured goods to competition policy and intellectual property rights. But more than that, it set the stage for Israel to be treated as a near neighbor with internal market light access.
And it is not just a simple trade deal, right? It creates a formal structure called the Association Council, where ministers from both sides meet to discuss everything from energy to human rights. But what really strikes me, Herman, is the sheer scale of the scientific cooperation. We are talking about the Horizon Europe program. Most people hear the word Horizon and think it is just some academic exchange, but the numbers tell a different story. It is the world's largest collaborative research and innovation program, and Israel is not just a participant, it is a top-tier performer.
Oh, the numbers are staggering. The total budget for Horizon Europe from 2021 to 2027 is €95.5 billion. Israel was actually the first non-European country to be associated with the predecessor of this program back in 1996. Since then, Israeli researchers and companies have been involved in thousands of projects. We are talking about cutting-edge work in quantum computing, decarbonization, and biotechnology. When you look at the success rate of Israeli applicants, they are consistently among the highest in the entire network. This is not charity from the European Union, it is a strategic necessity. Europe needs Israeli innovation as much as Israel needs European capital and markets. If you look at the European Research Council grants, which are the gold standard for individual excellence, Israeli universities often outperform entire mid-sized European nations.
That is a crucial point. It is a symbiotic relationship. If you're a research lab in Munich or a tech firm in Paris, your best partner for a specific breakthrough in artificial intelligence or medical imaging might very well be at the Technion in Haifa or the Weizmann Institute. When politics tries to sever those ties, it is not just hurting Israel. It is effectively a form of self-harm for European innovation. Yet that is exactly what we are seeing being proposed by certain factions within the European Union, led most vocally by Ireland. It is almost as if the Irish leadership is looking at this €95 billion engine in progress and saying, we would rather the engine stall than keep this specific passenger on board.
Ireland is a very interesting case study here. Over the last year, especially in 2025 and moving into early 2026, we have seen the Irish government take a position that is increasingly isolated within the bloc. They have been pushing for a formal review of the association agreement, specifically citing the Human Rights Clause, which is Article 2 of the agreement. Article 2 states that the relationship is based on respect for human rights and democratic principles. Ireland argues that Israel's actions in its regional conflicts constitute a breach of this article. They want to use that clause as a legal lever to suspend the entire trade and research framework.
But here is where it gets complicated. The European Union is not a monolith. You cannot just decide to cancel an agreement because one member state is unhappy. We discussed the domestic climate in Ireland back in episode 979, where we looked at the report showing a 60% increase in anti-Semitic incidents there in March of 2026. There is this concept we called the righteousness shield, where political leaders use high-minded rhetoric about international law to mask what often looks like a very specific, very focused hostility toward the Jewish state. It is a way of laundering domestic biases through the language of Brussels.
That righteousness shield is a perfect way to describe it. If you listen to the Irish leadership, they frame their opposition as a defense of universal values. But when you look at the consistency of their stance compared to how they treat other nations with far worse human rights records, the math does not add up. There is a deep-seated institutional bias that has permeated the Irish foreign ministry. They are trying to weaponize EU trade mechanisms to achieve a domestic political goal, which is to be seen as the most pro-Palestinian voice in the West. It is a form of brand building on the international stage, but it is being done at the expense of the European Union's collective strategic interests.
I want to push on that legal mechanism for a second, Herman. If Ireland wants to suspend the agreement, what is the actual process? Because from what I understand, they have run into a brick wall in Brussels. They keep bringing it up at the Foreign Affairs Council, and they keep getting the same response.
They have run into a very thick wall, and that wall is made of German and Czech stone. To suspend an association agreement, you generally need a unanimous decision by the European Council, or at the very least, a qualified majority that Ireland simply does not have. Countries like Germany, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Austria see Israel as a vital strategic partner, especially in the context of regional security and technology. They view Ireland's push as a dangerous precedent. If you start suspending trade agreements every time a member state has a foreign policy disagreement, the European Union's credibility as a reliable trade partner vanishes. Imagine the chaos if every time a government changed in a member state, they tried to tear up the EU's international treaties.
It would turn the common market into a political playground. Imagine if Hungary tried to suspend a trade deal with a different country based on their own specific grievances. The European Commission knows that if they let Ireland pull this thread, the whole sweater could come undone. But Ireland did try something quite radical in 2025, didn't they? They tried to pass domestic legislation to unilaterally restrict trade with Israeli entities. This was the move that really set off alarm bells in the Berlaymont building.
Yes, the so-called Settlements Bill, or the Occupied Territories Bill as it is often called. We covered the fallout of that in episode 1162. It was a risky gamble that essentially challenged the European Commission's exclusive competence over trade policy. Under EU law, individual member states do not have the power to run their own independent trade policy. That power was handed over to Brussels decades ago to ensure the integrity of the single market. The Commission had to step in and basically tell Dublin, look, you cannot ban goods from a specific territory if those goods are legally allowed into the rest of the EU. It created this bizarre situation where Ireland was trying to be more Catholic than the Pope, so to speak, on international law, while simultaneously violating the fundamental treaties of the European Union itself.
It is a fascinating bit of irony. In their zeal to punish Israel, they were willing to undermine the very legal structures that give Ireland its influence in the first place. If Ireland can ignore EU trade law, then why shouldn't France or Germany ignore EU fiscal rules or environmental standards? It is a race to the bottom. But let's look at the second-order effects here. If Ireland were to somehow succeed, or if they continue to create this atmosphere of uncertainty, what does that do to the actual people on the ground? I am thinking about the scientists and the entrepreneurs who do not care about the grandstanding in the Dale.
That is where the real damage happens. Research is built on long-term stability. If you are a scientist starting a 5-year project on quantum encryption, you need to know that your funding and your partnerships are not going to be evaporated by a vote in Brussels 6 months from now. We have already seen a chilling effect. In late 2025, there were reports of several joint climate tech projects being delayed or scaled back because the partners were worried about the political climate. Specifically, there was a major project involving Irish and Israeli researchers focused on high-efficiency desalination membranes. The Irish university involved reportedly pulled back because they were afraid of the domestic political optics and the potential for future legal restrictions.
That is tragic, honestly. Desalination is a technology that the entire world needs, especially with the climate trends we are seeing. To sacrifice that kind of progress for a political gesture is the height of irresponsibility. It is the weaponization of trade, as you said. When you introduce political volatility into technical frameworks, you create a risk premium. Suddenly, partnering with an Israeli university becomes a political liability for a European professor. They might have to spend more time defending the partnership to their administration than actually doing the research. And who wins in that scenario? Not Europe, not Israel. Probably China or other global competitors who are more than happy to fill the vacuum in high-tech collaboration.
Precisely. And let's be clear about what would be lost. Israel is a world leader in water desalination, in agricultural technology, and in cybersecurity. These are not luxury goods, these are the essential technologies of the 21st century. When Ireland pushes to sever these ties, they are essentially saying they would rather Europe be less secure and less technologically advanced than maintain a relationship with Israel. It is a remarkably short-sighted posture. It also ignores the fact that EU security agencies rely heavily on Israeli intelligence and cyber defense tools to protect European infrastructure from state-sponsored hacking.
It also reveals a lot about the shift in Irish foreign policy. Historically, Ireland viewed itself as a neutral, mediating force. But lately it feels like they have pivoted toward a more activist, almost ideological stance. They are willing to dismantle mutually beneficial partnerships to satisfy a domestic narrative. It is a form of virtue signaling that has real-world economic consequences. And as we mentioned, when you look at that 60% spike in anti-Semitic incidents in Ireland, you have to wonder how much of this moral diplomacy is actually being driven by a very ugly domestic undercurrent.
And it is worth comparing Ireland's posture to other non-EU states in the Mediterranean. The European Union has association agreements with many countries, some of which have very questionable democratic credentials or are involved in ongoing conflicts. Turkey, Egypt, Algeria, the list goes on. Yet we do not see Ireland leading a crusade to suspend trade with them. The focus is almost exclusively on Israel. This is why many analysts and many of our listeners see this as less about human rights and more about a specific animosity toward the Israeli state. It is a double standard that is becoming impossible to ignore in the halls of power in Brussels.
That brings us to the internal friction within the European Union. How are the other member states reacting to Ireland's persistent nagging on this issue? I imagine there is a fair amount of frustration in the hallways of Brussels when the Irish delegation starts their usual routine.
Frustration is putting it mildly. There is a sense that Ireland is being a bit of a one-note player right now. When the European Council meets to discuss massive issues like energy security, the war in Ukraine, or the rise of AI Ireland, constantly tries to steer the conversation back to suspending the Israel Association Agreement. It has reached a point where it is actually diminishing Ireland's diplomatic capital. If you use your outrage credits on the same topic every single time, people start tuning you out. I have heard from sources in Brussels that other diplomats are starting to view the Irish position as a domestic political distraction rather than a serious policy proposal.
It is a classic case of the boy who cried wolf, except in this case the wolf is a trade agreement that everyone else actually likes. I think it is also important to mention the Open Skies Agreement. This is another one of those technical frameworks that people take for granted until it is gone. It basically integrated Israel into the European Common Aviation Area. It is why you can fly from Dublin to Tel Aviv or Berlin to Tel Aviv for a fraction of what it used to cost.
Right, and that was a game changer for tourism and business. It lowered fares, increased the number of flights, and made Tel Aviv feel like just another European city in terms of connectivity. If Ireland had its way and we saw a broader decoupling, you would see the return of restrictive bilateral flight caps, higher prices, and less cultural exchange. It is the opposite of what the European project is supposed to be about, which is building bridges through economic and social integration. The Open Skies Agreement is a perfect example of how technical alignment creates tangible benefits for ordinary citizens. Breaking it would not just hurt the government in Israel, it would hurt every student, every tourist, and every small business owner who relies on that connectivity.
So, we have this tension between the technical reality of deep integration and the political reality of Irish opposition. Where does this go from here, Herman? We are sitting here in March of 2026. Is a soft decoupling inevitable, or will the institutional gravity of the relationship hold it together?
I think the institutional gravity is much stronger than the political friction. The European Commission is a very pragmatic beast. They look at the data. They see the value that Israeli firms bring to the European market. They see the security cooperation that happens behind the scenes, which is often tied to these broader agreements. While Ireland might succeed in delaying certain meetings or making the rhetoric more heated, the actual legal architecture of the EU-Israel relationship is incredibly resilient. It is built on treaties that require consensus to change, and that consensus simply does not exist. In fact, most member states want to deepen the relationship in areas like energy, especially with the Eastern Mediterranean gas fields becoming more important for European energy independence.
It seems to me that Ireland is actually the one risking isolation here. By pushing so hard for something that the major powers of Europe do not want, they are making themselves look like an outlier rather than a leader. It is a strange strategy for a small nation that depends so much on EU solidarity. If Ireland needs help on a future issue, say a fishing dispute or a corporate tax matter, they might find that their colleagues in Berlin or Prague are less inclined to listen because they are tired of the constant friction over Israel.
It is a high-risk, low-reward strategy. Even if they were to succeed in suspending a minor part of the agreement, the blowback from other member states would be significant. And for what? To satisfy a domestic political base that wants to see action against Israel. It is the definition of performative politics. Meanwhile, the actual work of innovation continues. Israeli startups are still opening offices in Berlin, and German engineers are still flying to Tel Aviv to work on autonomous vehicle sensors. The real world is moving on, while the politicians in Dublin are stuck in a loop.
Let's talk about the practical takeaways for our listeners. If you are trying to make sense of the news coming out of the European Union regarding Israel, what should you be looking for? Because the headlines can be very misleading. You see a headline that says, EU considers sanctions, and it sounds like the whole relationship is ending.
My first piece of advice is to ignore the calls for suspension. You will see a headline that says Ireland calls for suspension of EU-Israel trade deal. That happens almost every month. What you should actually look for is the status of the Horizon Europe renewals. When those grants are issued, and when the technical committees meet, that is where the real relationship lives. If those meetings are happening and those checks are being signed, the relationship is healthy, regardless of what a politician in Dublin says. Also, watch the European Investment Bank. If they are still backing projects that involve Israeli tech, the integration is proceeding as planned.
That is a great point. Follow the money and the science, not the speeches. Another thing to watch is the European Court of Justice. If Ireland or any other state tries to pass domestic laws that interfere with EU trade policy, the Court of Justice is where the real battle will be fought. As we saw with the Settlements Bill, the law is generally on the side of maintaining the integrity of the common market. The legal precedent is very clear. Trade policy is an exclusive competence of the European Union. Period.
And I think there is a broader lesson here about the fragility of international trade in the face of domestic populism. Even a relationship as deep and beneficial as the one between Israel and the EU can be stressed by a single determined member state using the right rhetoric. It is a reminder that these frameworks require constant maintenance and a defense of the technical over the ideological. If we allow trade agreements to be dismantled every time there is a diplomatic disagreement, we are heading toward a much poorer and more dangerous world.
It also highlights the importance of understanding the why behind these agreements. They were not created as a reward for good behavior. They were created because they served the strategic interests of both parties. When you forget that, you start treating trade as a lever for moral lecturing, which is a very dangerous path to go down. It turns the global economy into a series of litmus tests. And, as you often say, Herman, who gets to decide what the test is?
And who gets to set the litmus test? That is the question. If Ireland gets to set it for Israel today, who sets it for the next country tomorrow? This is why Germany and the others are so firm. They are protecting the principle that trade is a foundational, stabilizing force that should be insulated from the shifting winds of domestic politics. If you weaponize trade against one partner, you make every other partner nervous. It undermines the very idea of a rules-based international order.
I also think we should address the misconception that this is a one-way street. I have seen some commentaries suggesting that Israel is lucky to be part of these programs, but as you mentioned earlier, Herman, the benefit is very much mutual. In many fields, Europe is playing catch-up to Israeli innovation. If Europe cuts off Israel, they aren't just punishing Israel, they are slowing down their own progress in critical sectors.
Oh, absolutely. Look at cyber defense. Israel has one of the most sophisticated cyber ecosystems in the world. For European banks and infrastructure providers, having access to that expertise through collaborative research is a huge advantage. If you cut that off, you are leaving European systems more vulnerable. The same goes for medical tech. Some of the most advanced imaging and surgical robotics are coming out of Israeli labs. Do we really want to tell a patient in a European hospital that they cannot have the best treatment because of a diplomatic spat over borders in the Middle East? That is the real-world consequence of the decoupling that Ireland is pushing for.
It puts it into perspective when you frame it that way. The human cost of decoupling is real. It is not just a line on a balance sheet. It is a slower pace of scientific discovery and a less secure digital world. It is the difference between a new cancer treatment being available in 5 years versus 10 years. When you play politics with research, those are the stakes.
And that is why I think the soft decoupling that some people fear is unlikely to happen in a meaningful way. The stakes are too high. What we are likely to see instead is a widening gap between the political rhetoric and the institutional reality. The speeches will get louder, the votes in the Irish Parliament will get more frequent, but the planes will keep flying and the research will keep happening. The plumbing is just too deep to be destroyed by a few people with wrenches in Dublin.
It is a bit of a split-screen reality. On one screen you have the grandstanding in Dublin and the heated debates in the European Parliament. On the other screen you have the quiet, efficient work of the Association Council subcommittees, making sure that everything from pharmaceutical standards to agricultural exports is perfectly aligned. I know which screen I think is more important for the future of both regions.
I think our listeners do too. It is about looking past the righteousness shield and seeing the actual mechanics of global cooperation. It is a theme we keep coming back to on this show, whether we are talking about energy markets or technology standards. The plumbing matters more than the paint job. And right now, the plumbing of the Israel-EU relationship is remarkably robust, despite the best efforts of the Irish government to clog the drains.
Well said. I think we have covered a lot of ground here, from the €95 billion budget of Horizon Europe to the legal intricacies of the association agreement. It is a complex nexus, but a vital one. And it is one that, despite Ireland's best efforts, seems destined to remain a cornerstone of the Mediterranean and European landscape. It is a testament to the power of institutional integration over ideological posturing.
It really does. And if you want to dive deeper into some of the context we mentioned today, I highly recommend checking out those past episodes. Episode 979 on the Irish anti-Semitism crisis, and episode 1162 on the settlements. Bill really provide the foundational knowledge for why we are seeing this friction today. You can find all of those in our archive at myweirdprompts.com. They provide the necessary background to understand that this isn't just about one bill or one speech, it is about a long-term trend in Irish politics.
And if you are enjoying these deep dives into the intersection of technology, trade, and geopolitics, please do us a favor and leave a review on your podcast app. Whether you are on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, those ratings really help more people find the show and join the conversation. We genuinely appreciate the support. It helps us keep the lights on and the research flowing.
We really do. It is what keeps us diving into these research papers and following the diplomatic cables. Also, for those of you who want to stay updated in real time, search for My Weird Prompts on Telegram. We post every time a new episode drops, and it is a great way to make sure you never miss a deep dive. We also share some of the source documents we use for our research there.
We will be keeping a close eye on the Horizon Europe renewals and any further moves from Dublin as we move through 2026. There is always another layer to these stories, and we will be here to unpack them. The next few months will be critical as the EU starts planning for the post-2027 research framework. That will be the real test of Israel's long-term status.
That is the plan. It has been a pleasure as always, Corn. This has been My Weird Prompts.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We will catch you in the next one.
Take care.
I think we really hit the heart of it today, Herman. That contrast between the technical and the performative is just so stark in this specific relationship. It is almost like two different worlds operating in the same space. You have the world of diplomats and the world of engineers, and they barely speak the same language.
It really is. And it is a testament to the people who built these frameworks that they can withstand this much political pressure. It is easy to destroy things, but it is very hard to build a €95 billion research network that actually works. The resilience of these systems is the real story here.
It is the builders versus the breakers. And in the long run, the builders usually have the better arguments because they are the ones actually delivering the innovation and the prosperity. The breakers might get the headlines, but the builders get the results.
Precisely. Well, I am going to go see if Daniel has any more weird prompts for us. I saw him reading a paper on deep-sea mining earlier, so who knows where we are headed next. He was looking at the regulations for the Clarion-Clipperton Zone.
Oh boy. Deep-sea mining. That is going to be another technical rabbit hole, isn't it? I can already see the diagrams of robotic crawlers on the ocean floor.
You know it. I have already got the tab open for the International Seabed Authority's latest regulations. There is some fascinating stuff about polymetallic nodules and the environmental impact of sediment plumes.
I should have known. All right, let's wrap this up before you start explaining the chemistry of manganese crusts.
Too late. I was just getting to the cobalt content. But fine, we will save it for another day.
Thanks again for listening, everyone. Head over to myweirdprompts.com for the RSS feed and all the other ways to subscribe. We will see you soon.
Goodbye for now.
You know, Herman, I was thinking about that 60% increase in anti-Semitic incidents we mentioned. It really puts the political maneuvering in a different light. When you see that kind of domestic climate, you realize that the foreign policy isn't happening in a vacuum. It is often a reflection of internal pressures that politicians are either trying to lead or trying to follow.
It is a feedback loop, Corn. The political rhetoric fuels the public sentiment, and then the politicians feel they have to double down to stay ahead of that sentiment. It is a dangerous cycle, especially when it targets a specific community or a specific state. That is why we call it the righteousness shield. It allows people to feel like they are standing for a moral cause while engaging in or excusing very ugly behavior. It provides a sense of moral cover for what is essentially a targeted campaign of exclusion.
It is a sobering thought, but it is why we do this show, to look at the data and the history and try to see what is actually happening underneath the surface. We want to provide the context that the headlines often leave out.
No matter how loud the noise gets, the facts are still there if you are willing to look for them. The data on trade, the data on research, and the data on public sentiment. It all tells a story if you connect the dots.
Well, on that note, let's head out. I think I hear Daniel in the kitchen.
Probably making more coffee. We are going to need it if we are diving into deep sea mining next. That is a lot of technical reading.
Tell me about it. All right, thanks for listening to my weird prompts. We will see you in the next episode.
Bye, everyone.
One last thing, Herman. Do you think the EU will ever actually move toward a more centralized foreign policy to prevent this kind of friction? Or are we stuck with this consensus model forever?
That is the million-euro question. There are definitely voices in Brussels pushing for qualified majority voting on foreign policy so that one country like Ireland or Hungary can't block the whole group. But the smaller states are terrified of that because it means they lose their veto power. It is a fundamental tension in the EU's design. It is the struggle between being a superpower and being a club of sovereign nations.
It is the ultimate balancing act. Efficiency versus sovereignty.
And as long as that tension exists, we will have plenty of prompts to talk about. It is the engine that drives EU politics.
Fair enough. See you later, Herman.
See ya, Corn.
And remember, everyone, you can find the Telegram channel by searching for My Weird Prompts. It is the best way to stay in the loop and get the latest updates.
Definitely. All right, now we are really going.
For real this time. Bye!
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the flows from slow